Today's lesson is the code that revolutionized communication. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to talk about a peculiar kind of code. When we hear the word code these days, people think of coding when you write information for computers and things like that. But in this particular case, it's a form of communication.
Right. We're going to be talking about Morse code. And Morse code was something that was used quite frequently, especially during wars. And a code is basically a system of symbols or words or letters that allows someone to convey information in a way that only another person who knows the system can understand it.
Right, and the code we're talking about today again is the Morse code, and that's just a series of dots and dashes that was used a long time ago in communication before we could do it with radio or with computers and the internet and things like that. And it might still be useful in modern life, so we're going to talk about it today. So let's begin our lesson by listening to the first part, and then we'll come right back.
The code that revolutionized communication. In the past, sending messages over long distances was a time-consuming and often unreliable task. Letters could take weeks or months to deliver and often went missing. To send messages quickly, such as in military situations, one had to use smoke signals, drums, or even messenger pigeons, all of which were at the mercy of Mother Nature.
大家好，标题中我们来介绍动词 revolutionize， 它的意思是给点点点带来革命性变革，或是使点点点发生巨变。例如 The internet revolutionized human communication， 网际网络给人类通讯带来了革命性的转变。或者 The discovery of penicillin revolutionized modern medicine， 盘尼西林的发现彻底改变了现代医学。接着一样是标题中的 communication， 这个名词是通讯、传播或是沟通交流的意思。例如 This radio is used for communication purposes， 这台无线电是用来做通讯用的。或是 Sasha doesn't get along well with her parents because their lack of communication， Sasha 和她的父母相处得不好，因为他们缺乏沟通。再来介绍形容词 time consuming，它的意思是耗时的。举例来说 Assembling the toy was a time-consuming process. 组合这个玩具的过程很费时。又或者说 Learning a new skill can be time-consuming, but rewarding as well. 学习新的技术可能会很费时，但会有很大的回报。下一个我们来看到片语 at the mercy of 名词，它的意思是任凭点点点摆布，或是完全由点点点支配。例如 The lost hikers were at the mercy of the elements. 迷路的登山客只能看老天的脸色。
So the title of today's lesson is The Code That Revolutionized Communication. As we mentioned before, code here refers to the Morse code, and it revolutionized communication. When you revolutionize something, you completely change that thing. Or you could say that to revolutionize means to completely alter the way people think or do things. I could say, for instance, that today, computers have revolutionized the way we work. And in this case, Morse code revolutionized communication. Now, communication refers to the process of exchanging information or expressing how one feels and thinks. So I could say as an example that communication is very important in a relationship because when you're in a relationship, you have to understand how your partner feels and what they think. So you have to communicate with your partner.
Right. When you have thoughts and ideas and you communicate them to another person, you transmit them to another person, they receive them, and then they reply. That's all about communication. The verb form is to communicate. Yes, we need to communicate to get rid of those misunderstandings. Now, here in the first part of our lesson, it says, in the past, sending messages over long distances distances was a time-consuming and often unreliable task. So we're talking about the past, maybe the distant past, longer than 100 or 200 years ago. And if you wanted to send a message to somebody, it was quite complicated. You probably had to send it by mail, and then the letter had to be transported from one place to another by a ship or by a horse or whatever. And it was very time-consuming. That means it takes a lot of time.
That's right. Time-consuming just means taking a lot of time, and many activities are quite time-consuming, such as preparing meals, because you have to not only cook the meal, you have to do the cleaning up afterwards, and you have to do all sorts of things around preparing lunch or dinner. So preparing food can be time-consuming.
Exactly. And of course, in the past, communication was time-consuming, and it was also unreliable. You didn't really know if your message was going to get through. And letters could take weeks or months to deliver and often went missing. In the past, I do remember sending letters to people or postcards, and sometimes the recipient just did not receive that letter or that postcard. So yes, indeed, sometimes they just go missing. Nobody knows where they went to. And to send messages quickly, such as in military situations, one had to use smoke signals, drums, or even messenger pigeons. My goodness, so if you had a military campaign, if you were attacking another country, maybe back in the Tang Dynasty or something, if they wanted to communicate with the troops in the field, they had to use some kind of primitive means of communication, like using smoke signals or the sound of drums beating, or they would even have birds, like pigeons, which would send messages.
Right, so these pigeons are called messenger pigeons. Now, a messenger is somebody whose job is to deliver messages. And back then, when there weren't emails or computers to send those emails, messages had to be conveyed in person by a messenger who took the note from one person to another. And that's how information was conveyed. And sometimes, instead of using people, pigeons were used. So the message would be on a piece of paper, which would be rolled up, and then it would be attached, I think, to the pigeon's leg. And then the pigeon would be sent off to a destination, to the recipient, and the recipient would take that note from the pigeon, and then the pigeon would bring back another message. And that was the messenger pigeon.
Right, and the pigeons, of course, had to be specially trained for this task. And I think the enemy probably were aware that the other army was trying to send messages, so they probably tried to shoot those pigeons down if they saw them taking off. And that means it could have been unreliable, or an unreliable means of communication. And all of these were at the mercy of Mother Nature. So if you're at the mercy of something, you don't have any control over that thing, and you cannot control it, you cannot predict it. So indeed, if we're hiking in the mountains, for example, we may be at the mercy of the weather. It might start raining and we'll be in big trouble.
Right. Or if you're a criminal and you've been caught by the police, the criminal would then be at the mercy of the law, because the fate of that criminal would be decided by the judge or by the law. And here, Mother Nature simply refers to nature. We often refer to nature as Mother Nature, especially when we want to talk about how nature affects people's lives.
Right. It could be the weather. It could be a tornado. It could also be an earthquake or a flood or a big fire or something like that. Those are all parts of Mother Nature. We tend to look at the natural world as being female. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the second part. We will listen to it first.
In the 1830s, however, an American inventor named Samuel Morse came up with a system for sending messages using electricity. The system was fast and reliable. Electrical pulses were sent through wires between stations, which could be many miles apart. This allowed almost instant communication over vast distances. But in order to allow people to make sense of the pulses, Morse needed to develop a special code.
第二部分我们看到单字 vast， 它是形容词，指的是广阔的、浩瀚的或是巨大的。例如 The national park covers a vast area of mountains, lakes, and forests. 那个国家公园涵盖广大的山脉、 湖泊和森林区域。又或者说 Vast amounts of information are available online, but not all of it is reliable. 在网络上可以得到大量的资讯，但它们并非全部都是可靠的。接着是片语 make sense of 名词，指的是理解或是了解。例如 Astrophysics doesn't make sense to many people. 天体物理学对许多人来说不易理解。或是 It was hard to make sense of what the man was saying because of all the loud noise in the background. 因为背景很吵杂，所以很难听得懂这个人在说什么。
So in the last part, we looked a bit at the challenges of conveying or sending messages. However, around the middle of the 19th century, things took a turn. In the 1830s, however, an American inventor named Samuel Morse came up with a system for sending messages using electricity. So indeed, this was a very new way of sending messages because you didn't have to rely on smoke signals, drums, or even messenger pigeons anymore. Using electricity was a way that guaranteed a faster way of sending messages.
Right. This happened way back in the 1830s, and we have an American inventor. His name was Samuel Morse. And again, he came up with a system for communication, and it used electricity, which of course is electric power. Now, the system was fast and reliable, okay? So you could depend on this particular system, and it was fast. It took a very short amount of time compared to previous methods of communication, and electrical pulses were sent through wires between stations, which could be many miles apart. So here we've got something having to do with electricity. That means electrical power, for example. And a pulse is like a sudden burst of something. Normally we use the word pulse when we talk about the feeling of our blood flowing through our veins. When we touch our wrist there with our fingers, we can feel our pulse there. But a pulse can be some kind of rhythm. And in this particular case, we're talking about electrical pulses, period of intensity, and then nothing.
Right. So a pulse can also be described as a brief burst of electricity or light when we are talking about electricity or light. And these electrical pulses were sent through wires between stations. Now, we typically think of stations as train stations or perhaps bus stations, but a station can also refer to a place that is the center of a particular activity. So we can also say a police station or a fire station.
Right. Although sometimes people confuse a bus station with a bus stop. A bus station is where you get on a bus to go a long distance, like to go to Taichung or Kaohsiung or Hualien or whatever. But if it's a regular route inside a city, then you would go to the bus stop to wait for the bus, unless it goes to the end, and that probably would be the station at the end. But all the stops in between are bus stops, although in the MRT you still refer to everything as a station. But in this particular case, we're talking about communication stations. I would guess we're talking about telegraph stations, and they would send these messages through wires between these different stations, and these stations could be many miles apart. And apart here just means they are a certain distance from each other. They're separated by a distance. So yes, these stations could be many miles apart, maybe 10 miles apart, maybe 20 miles apart, 100, 1,000. They could send messages over long distances almost instantaneously. I believe electric signals move at the speed of light.
Right. So this system allowed almost instant communication over vast distances. And as Roger was saying before, the stations were located apart from one another, which means that they were not close to each other. And here it says that there were vast distances between the stations. So vast means extremely large or extremely wide. And if the distances are vast, it means that the distances are very large. I could also say a vast piece of land or a vast amount of money simply to mean that the amount is very large.
Right, so we could be talking about vast distances, like between the United States and Taiwan, for example. That is a vast distance. or between the United States and Europe, for example. We could send instant communication over those vast distances, but in order to allow people to make sense of the pulses, Morse needed to develop a special code. So yeah, you can send these pulses through those wires, and the recipient can receive them, but they may not mean anything to that person. So you need to have a kind of system, you need to have patterns so that people can understand what you're trying to say.
Yes, and here the phrase makes sense of simply means to understand something, usually something that is complicated or difficult to understand.
Right, so recently I met a guy from northern England and he was talking and I just couldn't understand him because I was not familiar with his accent, so it was very difficult for me to make sense of what he was saying. And it was probably true of him as well, talking about me. He probably couldn't make sense of what I was saying either. And yes, indeed, people needed to make sense of these pulses. So, of course, you had to develop some kind of code so that you could have mutual understanding. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson. Here comes the third part.
The code, which came to be known as Morse code, takes each number, letter, and punctuation mark and assigns it a pattern of short and long pulses called dots and dashes, respectively. Commonly used letters have the shortest patterns. E, for example, is represented by a single dot. Less common letters use up to 4 dots and dashes, and punctuation marks use 6. A question mark, for instance, is
dd.ddit.
第三部分先看到 assign 这个单字，它是动词，表示分配、指派或是委派。我们可以说 As a hospital nurse, Claire is often assigned to night duty. 作为一名医院护理师 ，Claire 经常被指派上夜班。又或者说 After Tony was promoted, he assigned his best friend to be his assistant. Tony 升迁后，指定他最好的朋友当他助理。下一个看到 respectively。这个副词的意思是分别的或是各自的。例如 Leah and Alvaro are going to trade conferences in Portugal and Spain, respectively. Leah 和 Alvaro 将分别前往葡萄牙和西班牙参加贸易会议。最后一个例子 After finishing the dinner, Max and his sister returned to their bedrooms, respectively. 在吃完晚餐后 Max 和妹妹各自回到了自己的房间。
So in the last part, we talked about a system of communications that was based on electrical pulses. And the problem was that these pulses needed to be understood. So a code had to be invented to make these pulses have meaning. And that code was invented by Samuel Morse. Now, the code, which came to be known as Morse code, takes each number, letter, and punctuation mark and assigns it a pattern of short and long pulses called dots and dashes, respectively. So the code known as Morse code contains numbers, letters, and punctuation marks. So we know what numbers and letters are. Punctuation marks are those symbols such as periods, commas, exclamation marks, and question marks. So those are the marks that give additional meaning to a sentence. And these punctuation marks also have specific symbols in Morse code.
Right, and again, these are patterns of short and long pulses, and they're called dots and dashes. So a dot is very short, dot, 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 and a dash is longer, dash, dash, dash. And these numbers, letters, and punctuation marks are assigned a pattern of short and long pulses. So here we've got the verb to assign. That means they are given this. You could be assigned something in your class, for example. Your teacher may give you an assignment, something that you have to do. Maybe you have to read a couple of chapters in your book or write a report or something. That means the teacher has assigned you to do something, and we're talking about these things respectively. So again, we have numbers, letters, and punctuation marks, and then you have short and long pulses called dots and dashes, respectively. So that means the short pulses are called dots, and the long pulses are called dashes. That's when you say respectively. For example, I could say, John and Roger like rice and noodles, respectively. That means John likes rice and Roger likes noodles. You get the point there.
That's right. And commonly used letters have the shortest patterns. E, for example, is represented by a single dot because the letter E is commonly used in words and in sentences, so that letter is represented by a single dot. Now, less common letters use up to 4 dots and dashes, and punctuation marks use 6. A question mark, for instance, is di da da di dit.
And we'll continue talking about the Morse code in our next program, but right now we're going to listen to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第2部分最后一句提到，为了让人们能够理解脉冲，摩斯需要开发一种特殊的代码。文中是用 allow people to make sense of the pulses 来表达让人们能够理解脉冲。那 make sense of 在这边是表达理解、了解， pulse则有脉搏的意思，可是在这边是指脉冲。好，那这边我们要整理的是 allow somebody to 加原形动词的用法。首先，动词 allow 它有允许、准许的意思，我们常常用 allow somebody to 加原形动词去表达允许某人做某事，或者是也可以用被动语态 somebody be allowed to 加上原形动词，也就是某人被允许做某事。举例来说， You're not allowed to take photos here. 这里禁止拍照。好，那我们还可以用到 allow somebody to 加原形动词，表达让某人得以怎么样，能够怎么样，就像是课文里面的用法。举例来说， This app allows you to create your own emoji. 这款应用程式让你可以创造自己的表情符号。好，我们也顺便补充一下片语动词 allow for 的用法。第一种呢，我们可以用 allow for 去表达使变的有可能，像 The new system allows for more efficient data processing. 新的系统能让资料处理更有效率。那第二个，我们可以用 allow for 去表达考量到，或者是把什么计算在内，像是 Please arrive early, allowing for traffic and parking. 考量到交通状况及停车，请提早抵达。好，那么读到课文第3部分的最后一句，他说Less common letters use up to 4 dots and dashes. 它是表达说较不常用的字母使用多达4个点和画。那文中用到 up to 是表达多达、高达，后面通常会接表示数字或数量等等的名词。我们这边也补充一下 up to 的其他用法。好，第一个，如果是用事物当主词 something be up to somebody 表示是某人的责任，由某人来决定。例如 It's up to you 就可以表达由你决定，你决定就好。好，那第二个，我们用人当主词的话 somebody be up to 加上名词或动名词，这有2种意思。一个是表达某人有能力做某事，有能力去处理或执行某事，像 Do you think they are up to the challenge?你认为他们有办法应付那个挑战吗？那另外一个意思则是表达某人在计划某事，偷偷做某事，尤其是不好的事。像有一个用语是 up to no good， 就可以表达图谋不轨哦。好，那第3个我们可以用 up to 来表达跟 until 差不多的语义，像 up to yesterday 直到昨天， up to this point 到此刻为止，到目前为止。好，那以上今天重点整理，我们回顾解单字吧。
Code. Using a special code, the spy was able to send secret messages back to headquarters. Communication. Effective communication is key in building strong relationships. Time-consuming. Many people find that commuting in heavy traffic is highly time-consuming. Messenger. During the war, the horse messenger service became a valuable military resource. Pulse. The scientist observed a rapid pulse of light as the experiment reached its peak intensity. Vast. To the west of the small village was a vast desert full of sand. A sign. For security purposes, the online store assigns a unique ID number to each user account.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.